as I think everybody appreciates, the macroeconomic scene is as unstable and as unpredictable for the moment as our geopolitical scene. We have already a world that is shaken by conflicts, that is still, in a way, responding to the long shadow of the COVID period and the inflation that resulted in that, that is shaken by the breaking of long-standing supply chains, especially between the United States and China, and that, of course, is also being disrupted massively by the tremendous breakthroughs in technology. And in addition, of course, we have a U.S. administration that has a lot of unpredictability in the months ahead. If President Trump is true to his word, he will lead the most protectionist administration that we've had in decades. He proclaims himself an ideological protectionist. He believes that the U.S. economy needs tariff protection. He aims to collect revenues from these tariffs. And of course, another dimension of this protectionist policy is taking aim at China and actually aiming to hinder China's economic growth by limiting the expansion of China's exports in the U.S. markets. All told, it's clear that the macroeconomic situation is unstable and to an important extent unpredictable until we see the actual policies of the incoming U.S. government and continue to see the implications of the geopolitical tensions. In that context, I want to make a few recommendations, actually. I think it is fair to say, and even with all the high unpredictability, right to forecast that China's access to the U.S. market and almost surely to the European markets as well will continue to be hindered and I think even reduced in the coming years. I think it's likely that Trump will follow through on at least some of his campaign statements regarding the rise of tariff rates vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Europe, and vis-a-vis even the North American partners of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Some tariff increases are likely. It's already the case that China's exports to the U.S. market have stopped growing many years ago, and indeed significantly declined from their peaks. So there is no realistic prospect, in my view, even with negotiations ahead, of China enjoying any significant growth of exports to the U.S. market and probably more generally to the U.S. and the EU combined. And we already see the implications of this clearly as one of the major factors, and I would argue the major factor in the current relative weakness of the Chinese macroeconomy. Of course, the Chinese macroeconomy is not weak by any means. It's growing at nearly 5%. Nonetheless, the growth has come down, and there is a real puzzle as to where the growth is going to come in the future. It is important to understand the nature of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. I believe it to be the case that this is a policy aiming not only at protecting U.S. companies, but also at deliberately trying to stall China's growth. And for me, it has a lot of similarity to the policies that the United States followed vis-a-vis Japan towards the end of the 1980s. In that period, even though Japan was a security ally of the United States, Japan was viewed as a threat to the US economy because of its great success in manufacturing growth and in the growth of Japan's exports to the United States. And starting in the mid-1980s, the US took actions to stop the growth of Japan's exports. These came in a currency arrangement, the Plaza Accord, which dramatically overvalued the yen. And then it came in a series of so-called voluntary export restraints, which Japan adopted, which were anything but voluntary. They were designed to commit Japan to stop the growth of exports of electronics goods, semiconductors, memory chips, and automobiles to the US market. At the end of the 1980s, Japan's growth started to stall significantly, and as Japan's growth was downrated, the asset prices in Japan plummeted. So Japan had a financial shock that was secondary to the trade restrictions. And in 1990-91, the stock market and land prices fell sharply in Japan. The bubble was burst, as it was described. And starting in 1992, Japanese growth slowed considerably over the next 20 plus years. This, in my opinion, was intentional US policy. Maybe not to hurt Japan overall, but to stop Japan's competition with the United States. And Japan's response was to keep the yen strong, and rather than trying to find other export markets, it was to increase the budget deficit and use fiscal stimulus to offset the loss of export growth. Japan ran consistently enormous budget deficits for the next 2 decades and drove up the public debt to more than 200% of GDP and the net public debt to around 150% of GDP. I mention all of this because the situation in China looks similar, to me at least, which is the US becoming protectionist, partly to protect the US market, partly to hinder China's growth, and China's growth slowing as a result.